The annual Flaxborough Flower and Produce Show was, as ever, a gentle exercise in civic pride. The town hall's main hall smelled faintly of carnations and polished floorboards, a mixture that seemed to reassure its patrons that all was as it should be. Mrs. Hargreaves, chairman of the organising committee, swept the hall with the gaze of a woman who had devoted 55 years to the precise arrangement of begonias and bean displays alike. "Order, please," she murmured, to a cluster of gossiping ladies by the refreshment table, though no one had been particularly disorderly. Inspector Purbright, seated near the rear, observed the proceedings with his usual patience. He was there under the pretext of supporting local culture. In truth, he enjoyed the delicate choreography of small-town rivalry. Each flower, each meticulously stacked tray of scones told its own story, and Purbright had long ago learned that stories rather than statutes revealed a town's true character. The mayor, red-faced from the exertion of welcoming every exhibitor personally, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you will find today's entries both charming and competitive, and may I remind you that the judging will commence precisely at—" A sudden commotion interrupted him. From the far end of the hall, near the display of dahlias, came a small, high-pitched squeal. Heads turned, purses clutched, and a collective murmur rippled through the audience. Sister Agnes of the nearby convent, noted in town for her immaculate habits and occasionally scolding tone, had disappeared. Or, to be more accurate, she was not where she was expected to be. One moment she'd been assisting with the prize cards, the next she had vanished, leaving her tray of meticulously arranged ribboned rosettes untouched. "Has anyone seen Sister Agnes?" Mrs. Hargreaves asked, her voice quivering with both indignation and worry. A cluster of young mothers speculated nervously, their own hands twitching toward their handbags as though some criminal intent might have leapt from the nun to them. Purbright rose gently, not with haste, but with purpose. He stepped toward the dais, nodded politely to Mrs. Hargreaves, and inquired, "Had she any reason to step away? Do we know?" The exhibition steward, a nervous man with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, offered, She didn't say anything. She just seemed, well, distracted, I suppose." His voice suggested that even in distraction there might be sin. "Distracted nuns are rarely dangerous," Purbright said mildly, to no one in particular, though his tone carried the faintest hint of amusement. He had learned over many years that people would often volunteer more than facts when prodded by calm observation. From the back, a whisper rose. "Do you think she's ill?" The speaker, a teenage girl clutching a bouquet of marigolds, looked at Purbright as though the answer might require immediate intervention. "Perhaps," Purbright replied, the word balanced with careful neutrality. Then, noting the collective anxiety, he added, "Or perhaps she simply went for a walk. Sister Agnes is known for her punctuality, yes, but she has also been known to vanish for a quiet contemplation." His words did little to soothe the hall. By this time the mayor had approached with a wheeze, his ceremonial chain catching the light, and a small knot of onlookers had formed near the doorway, peering out into the mild August afternoon. As Purbright moved toward the gathering crowd, he noted the small but curious details. The ribbon on the dahlia display was slightly skewed. A chair had been nudged as if hastily abandoned, and peculiarly one of the afternoon tea sandwiches had a single bite taken from it, despite the display being formally closed. "Nothing seems overtly criminal," he murmured to himself, with the faintest smile. "Yet in Flaxborough, nothing merely is." He stepped out into the sunlit lane beyond the hall. The convent was but a short walk away, and yet the streets seemed unnervingly empty, as though the town itself was holding its breath. In such quiet moments, Purbright knew the subtle truths of human nature often revealed themselves first through hesitation and half-truths rather than through dramatic confessions. And on this seemingly ordinary August afternoon, one small disappearance was about to make the town very interesting indeed. By mid-morning, the news of Sister Agnes's disappearance had spread beyond the confines of the hall like dandelion seeds in a summer breeze. In Flaxborough, facts were rarely as persuasive as supposition, and the townspeople's imaginations, fertile as Mrs. Hargreaves's prize begonias, had quickly taken root. At the railway buffet, Mr. Latch, the station master, shook his head with solemn gravity. "Disappeared, you say? Well, one never knows with them religious types. Perhaps she's off visiting some poor soul in distress. Could be anything." His companion, a retired bank clerk with a penchant for dramatics, leaned forward. Or perhaps something more sinister. Haven't we had trouble before, even if only whispered? Meanwhile, outside the town hall, a small knot of ladies discussed the incident in tones loud enough to be overheard by passers-by. "I dare say it's most irregular," said Mrs. Pennington, who had once mistaken a stray cat for a parish scandal. "I suppose she might have fainted, or perhaps—" She lowered her voice dramatically. "Someone could have spirited her away." Purbright, making his way discreetly down the main street, allowed the murmurs to filter into his understanding of the town. He did not intervene, for there was value in letting conjecture blossom freely. In these early stages, the nuances of fear, relief and gossip were as telling as any tangible clue. At the convent, the Mother Superior was assembling her sisters, each clearly rattled by the absence. "Sister Agnes is punctual to a fault," she said, her voice measured but tight with worry. "One cannot simply vanish from one's duties. We must assume she's still within reach of our understanding, though I confess—" Her gaze fell to the polished floor as if it might yield the missing sister's presence. Purbright visited shortly after, noting the quiet order of the cloistered spaces and the faint aroma of incense mingling with the warm morning sun. "I imagine," he remarked, "that Sister Agnes's routines are seldom interrupted. Do you recall any recent events that might have unsettled her?" "None at all," said the Mother Superior. Yet Purbright caught a flicker of hesitation as the words left her lips. A subtle shift that spoke of private anxieties. Back in the town, the baker's shop had become an impromptu information hub. Every loaf and pastry seemed imbued with gossip. Mrs. Whitcomb, perched on a stool, clutched her purse and recited a series of possible explanations, each more elaborate than the last. "I heard from a friend who saw her near the old mill yesterday, pacing as though expecting someone. But who? And why?" Even the more sceptical townsfolk could not resist entertaining the theory. Mr. Davies, who had previously claimed to despise speculation, muttered under his breath about the curious timing of the disappearance and the subtle tensions between convent and town council. Through it all, Purbright observed with his usual equanimity. The patterns of the human psyche were often revealed not in grand declarations, but in these fleeting contradictions, the rapid shifts between worry and curiosity, the secretive glances, the minor exaggerations. By late afternoon, a small clue had begun to surface, unremarkable yet persistent. A single white glove found near the dahlias at the flower show, faintly damp from the morning dew which Sister Agnes had never been known to wear. To anyone else, it might have seemed trivial. To Purbright, it was the first indication that something, though still subtle and delicate, had disturbed the ordinary course of Flaxborough life. As evening fell, the town seemed to hold its breath. Teacups lingered in hands, conversations stalled mid-sentence, and the faintest unease had begun to infiltrate the comfortable routines. Purbright returned to the hall one last time that day, glancing over the displays, the small but telling disruptions, the society notices pinned carelessly to the board. In his mind, he began assembling a quiet map of relationships, habits, and minor irritations, threads that, when drawn together, might unravel the mystery of the nun who had vanished in the night. Purbright began the next morning with a quiet plan. He did not rush. The Flaxborough streets, lined with their brick terraces and trimmed hedges, were patient witnesses to the slow unveiling of small-town mysteries. His first visit was to the flower show hall, now emptied of spectators but still carrying the faintly sweet aroma of carnations and polished wood. The white glove, carefully bagged in evidence, lay on the table beside a notebook, as if waiting for him to notice what others had overlooked. He spoke first with Mr. Grafton, the exhibition steward, who had been fidgeting since the previous day. "Did Sister Agnes handle the prize cards herself, as usual?" Purbright asked gently. Yes, she did," Grafton replied, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "But she seemed preoccupied. I thought perhaps it was the weather or, well, you know how some of them can be." He laughed, though the sound was hollow. "And when she vanished?" Purbright inquired, tilting his head ever so slightly. Grafton's eyes flicked to the table, then away. I thought perhaps she'd gone to the cloakroom. She sometimes disappears for a moment to gather herself, but this time she didn't return." Purbright noted the hesitation, storing it for later reflection. Next he called on Mrs. Hargreaves at her home, which smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She had mentioned something about a donation to the convent's garden fund, Mrs. Hargreaves said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But I thought it was the usual formalities. Nothing to worry about. Was there anyone in town who might have preferred that the convent, or Sister Agnes herself, be otherwise engaged? Purbright asked with casual curiosity, sipping a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Mrs. Hargreaves pursed her lips. Well, there are always small grievances. Mrs. Pennington, for example, was quite vexed that Sister Agnes had overseen the judging last year and didn't seem to favour her roses. Purbright nodded subtly, noting the first hints of friction between personalities whose disputes were ordinarily hidden beneath polite smiles. He moved on to the convent where the Mother Superior greeted him with measured calm. Sister Agnes is methodical, she said. She would not abandon her duties lightly. Her eyes, however, betrayed the slightest shadow of worry. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, letting the unspoken implications settle. Through his polite inquiries, Purbright began to build a mosaic of small contradictions. A steward uneasy at details he could not explain, a committee chair hinting at minor resentments, a convent clearly perturbed yet unwilling to confess concern. Each interview added depth, yet none suggested overt danger. It was the texture of human behaviour, rather than evidence, that drew Purbright's attention. By mid-afternoon, a minor but peculiar fact had emerged. A bicycle, ordinarily kept in the convent yard, was missing. Sister Agnes had been known to use it for errands, but it had not been signed out in any formal log. The glove, the slight disorder of the flower displays, the vanishing bicycle, all hinted at movement, but movement that was quiet, deliberate, and yet, in a sense, ordinary. Returning to the town hall, Purbright paused by the dahlia display. The ribbon still lay slightly askew, and the faint depression in the dust suggested someone had lingered there in thought or hesitation. He smiled faintly to himself. The truth, he reflected, was often hidden in these tiny deviations from routine, details the hurried or anxious eye would miss entirely. As the day drew to a close, the townspeople speculated endlessly. Perhaps she was spirited away by someone in a hurry, one shopkeeper muttered, or maybe she simply took a walk and never returned. The possibilities were endless, but to Purbright each theory was merely a layer of distraction waiting to be peeled back carefully. By nightfall he had made his rounds again, reviewing the patterns in his mind, the missing glove, the absent bicycle, the minor frictions among citizens. Nothing conclusive yet, but a web of subtle connections was forming, and Purbright knew that patience, observation, and the gentle uncovering of half-spoken truths would bring clarity in due time. In Flaxborough, even the quietest of incidents had a tendency to ripple outward, revealing character and motive with the precision of a master gardener pruning a hedge. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had begun to settle on a convenient narrative. To most townsfolk, the simplest explanation seemed to suffice. Sister Agnes had wandered off, perhaps in a fit of absent-mindedness or sudden inspiration. A few, however, could not resist more dramatic conjectures. Chief Constable Henshaw, a man devoted to procedure rather than nuance, had already suggested a tidy theory. She must have gone to visit someone and simply forgot to let anyone know. I dare say we'll find her near the riverside or at some neighbour's doorstep. No need for alarm. The town council, eager to preserve the impression of civic calm, nodded politely in agreement. Purbright, meanwhile, observed in his usual manner, quiet, patient and attentive to the undercurrents beneath the polite facades. He knew better than to accept convenience at face value. He retraced Sister Agnes's likely paths, the convent, the flower show, the market, and the streets connecting them. Each route suggested possibilities, but also revealed subtleties. A doorstep with a fresh scuff mark, the faint scent of lavender lingering outside a shop, the carefully aligned displays at the flower hall, all hinted at human presence and human habit. His inquiries led him naturally to Mrs. Pennington, whose roses had been slighted in last year's judging. She greeted him with the thin veneer of civility she reserved for outsiders. "I cannot imagine why anyone would trouble Sister Agnes," she said, fingers tightening around a lace-edged handkerchief. "Yet it is true, she has ways that unsettle some of us. Perhaps she wished to be alone." Purbright let the remark settle. There was a polite, almost imperceptible, tension in Mrs. Pennington's voice, an emphasis on words like "some of us," that suggested feelings beyond ordinary grievance. At the convent, the Mother Superior had begun to compile an informal timeline. She went to arrange the ribbons at the hall, then returned to assist the stewards, she explained. But after that, she simply did not appear at her usual evening prayers. Her eyes met Purbright's with quiet concern. He made no remark, allowing her unease to speak volumes in itself. By afternoon, Henshaw had appointed a single, first obvious suspect, Mr. Grafton, the steward whose nervousness during Purbright's initial inquiries had been apparent. He had been near the dahlia display when Sister Agnes disappeared, and his fidgeting, combined with an early misstatement about her last known location, seemed to satisfy the need for a neat solution. The council and a small but vocal segment of the townsfolk were pleased. A culprit, however circumstantial, gave them comfort. Purbright, however, withheld judgment. The inconsistencies he had noted, the skewed ribbon, the missing glove, the absent bicycle, did not converge convincingly on Grafton. There was a rhythm to Flaxborough life, and the disruption of that rhythm suggested subtlety rather than clumsiness. Grafton's unease might easily arise from embarrassment or overcaution, rather than culpability. By evening, the town's chatter had taken on a cadence of certainty. People recounted what they knew, layering conjecture atop conjecture. Purbright walked among them, listening, noting inflections, gestures, the small betrayals of habitual behaviour. In the quiet of his own study, he catalogued each detail, considering the ordinary motives of ordinary people, pride, rivalry, secret generosity, or an anxious conscience. It was, as always, the minor anomalies that most intrigued him. One teacup left on a table, a slightly disturbed ribbon, a bicycle parked at an unusual angle. These were not evidence in the forensic sense, but they carried the weight of human intention. Purbright felt with a gentle certainty that the pattern was emerging, though its form remained delicate and elusive. The first suspect might satisfy the town's appetite for closure, but Purbright knew better. In Flaxborough, the truth was rarely abrupt, rarely dramatic, and never entirely what it seemed. It would reveal itself quietly, politely, through careful observation, patient questioning, and the subtle pressure of a perceptive mind. Purbright returned to the flower hall the following morning, walking slowly among the stands as though he were reacquainting himself with old acquaintances. The dahlia display still bore the subtle tilt of the previous day, and the faint indentation in the dust where someone had paused drew his attention once again. It was a trivial detail, almost laughably small to anyone else, yet to him it suggested hesitation, a pause in routine, a moment of human indecision. He crouched slightly, examining the surface of the polished floor, noting how the light fell on a tiny scuff mark that seemed otherwise unnoticed. It was near where the glove had been found, a mere whisper of movement that might have been missed by any ordinary eye. Purbright's thought was quiet, reflective. In Flaxborough, even the smallest disturbance spoke of character, intention, or habit. Later, he wandered toward the bakery, where Mrs. Whitcomb had been holding court with her usual audience of eager listeners. "I noticed something odd," she said, lowering her voice as though admitting a scandalous truth. "Yesterday, when Sister Agnes was last seen, I could swear I glimpsed a bicycle near the hall. But when I looked again, it was gone, as if it had never been there." Purbright nodded, sipping his tea. The missing bicycle, coupled with the glove and the minor scuff, began to form a pattern in his mind, not one of force or confrontation, but of quiet, deliberate movement. The town's eagerness to pin the disappearance on Mr. Grafton seemed increasingly superficial. These minute anomalies hinted at someone with intimate knowledge of the convent's routines, someone who could move without drawing attention. He considered the timeline once more. Sister Agnes had been at the flower show arranging prize cards, had disappeared briefly, and then was nowhere to be found. The glove was found near the dahlia stand. The bicycle had vanished from the convent yard. None of these details indicated panic or struggle. They suggested care, subtle misdirection, and perhaps, most tellingly, a desire to be observed in absence rather than in action. That evening Purbright returned to the convent, taking the opportunity to walk the cloistered corridors alone. The air smelled faintly of incense and damp stone, a familiar comfort. He allowed his eyes to linger on door frames, the angle of light through windows, and the small items left in ordinary disarray. One corner, normally neat, bore a slight disturbance. A chair nudged askew, a book marginally out of line, a single pen resting at an odd angle. To any casual visitor, nothing would seem amiss. To Purbright, it was a whisper of human presence, a sign that the ordinary had been touched in subtle ways. He spent several quiet moments considering human nature, how people sought attention, avoided it, or manipulated perception without ever raising their voice. The trivial details of the flower hall, the bakery and the convent all pointed toward a person accustomed to routine, meticulous in habit, yet capable of orchestrating a subtle disruption. By the time he retired to his study, the pieces were not yet a full picture, but they were sufficient to suggest direction. In Flaxborough, the truth rarely announced itself in bold strokes. It was drawn in fine lines, like the delicate veins of a rose petal, only becoming evident to those willing to notice. Purbright, patient and deliberate, intended to notice everything. By mid-morning, the investigation had quietly broadened, like ripples extending from a pebble dropped in still water. Purbright had begun to visit townspeople whose routines intersected with Sister Agnes's in ways that seemed inconsequential at first glance, but, in Flaxborough, often carried hidden significance. He called on Mr. and Mrs. Trelawney, proprietors of the small bookshop near the market. "I noticed she came by occasionally," Mrs. Trelawney said, dusting a shelf, "mostly for reference books on gardening and local history. But yesterday, well, it was odd, she lingered longer than usual, as if she were waiting for someone." Mr. Trelawney, more taciturn, nodded, adding only that Sister Agnes had always been most courteous and patient, yet somehow attentive in a way that made one feel slightly observed. Purbright filed the remark quietly, aware that attentiveness was rarely an idle trait in Flaxborough. It was a mark of careful character and subtle influence. From the corner of town came the first hints of discord unrelated to the convent. The butcher, Mr. Craddock, complained about deliveries disrupted by the flower show, his irritation thinly veiling a deeper resentment of the event's social prominence. "I've nothing against Sister Agnes, of course," he insisted, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted apron. "But some of them get far too much attention for very little effort." The town councillors, meanwhile, continued to press Henshaw toward Mr. Grafton, finding solace in certainty. Purbright listened with polite neutrality, aware that the first suspect's apparent guilt was convenient but superficial. He preferred patterns over pronouncements, hints over hubris. At the convent, a minor revelation emerged from Sister Beatrice, a junior nun who had observed Sister Agnes with a quiet fascination. "She seemed unusually attentive to the roses along the cloister wall," Beatrice said, "and I thought I saw her glancing frequently toward the lane leading past the old mill." It was a small detail, easily dismissed, yet to Purbright it suggested deliberate movement and purpose, not random disappearance. By afternoon he returned to the flower hall, where he lingered near the dahlia display, examining the dust impressions and the small scuff marks with renewed attention. The white glove, still carefully preserved in evidence, seemed to pulse with understated significance. He noted too the bicycle rack's faint indentation in the earth nearby, suggesting a brief pause, perhaps to retrieve an object or to meet someone. Evening brought further complexity. The baker reported a visitor, an unfamiliar man in town the day before, who had lingered near the convent while ostensibly inquiring after bread prices. Mrs. Whitcomb had assumed him to be a deliveryman, yet she had noticed the purposeful glances he cast toward the convent yard. It was a trivial detail, almost amusing in its ordinariness, but Purbright filed it with care. By nightfall he had constructed a tentative web of interactions. Sister Agnes's habitual routes, minor resentments among townsfolk, fleeting visits and glances, and small but telling anomalies. The glove, the bicycle, the faint scuff marks, and the observer who passed unnoticed by most. Each thread suggested careful orchestration rather than haphazard wandering. Purbright reflected on the nature of the town, on human habit and pride, on the understated ways in which people expressed intention. Flaxborough, for all its quaint streets and polite facades, revealed its secrets in moments so subtle that only patient attention could discern them. He knew the mystery was far from simple, yet he also sensed the pattern emerging, delicate and precise, waiting for the moment to be drawn fully into the light. Late one afternoon, a new development quietly shifted the tenor of the investigation. The postman, delivering routine correspondence along the lane beside the convent, noticed something unusual, a small bundle of notes tucked under a garden gate, damp from the morning dew yet intact. Word of the discovery spread swiftly, and the townspeople, ever eager for narrative, speculated with relish. Purbright arrived shortly thereafter, taking the bundle carefully into his possession. The notes were brief, written in Sister Agnes's neat hand, yet they contained no explanation for her absence, only references to meetings, errands, and a series of mundane observations about the town itself. They were, in their very ordinariness, perplexing. Whoever had seen them could have inferred nothing untoward, and yet their placement suggested intentional concealment. The minor incident introduced fresh uncertainty. Mr. Grafton, the previously designated suspect, appeared increasingly uncomfortable as the narrative shifted away from him. The counsel, previously eager for closure, now faced the subtle embarrassment of a theory unsettled. Purbright, however, took no overt pleasure in the reversal. His focus remained on patterns, timing, and the gentle hints embedded in daily behaviour. Further inquiries revealed a small, almost comical mishap. The local grocer, Mr. Frobisher, had accidentally delivered a crate of apples to the convent that morning, a crate slightly askew and causing a minor disturbance in the yard. One of the apples, resting near the bicycle's usual position, bore the faint impression of a gloved hand. Trivial to the casual observer, yet to Purbright it reinforced the notion that someone had handled the bicycle recently, perhaps moving it, perhaps leaving a mark of intention. As evening settled, the convent itself became the quiet epicentre of speculation. Sister Beatrice confessed to having noticed, over the previous week, Sister Agnes occasionally speaking with a voice lowered to a whisper when she thought no one was near. The content of these murmured words was unknown, yet the deliberate secrecy hinted at private concerns or plans, small yet significant in the context of the disappearance. Purbright spent hours reflecting on the layering of events. The glove, the bicycle, the scuff marks, the misplaced apples, and the secretive whispers all pointed not to sudden panic or external coercion, but to careful, deliberate movement. Someone operating within the ordinary routines of Flaxborough, yet slightly outside its expectations. The truth, he thought, would emerge not from dramatic revelation, but from the quiet unfolding of ordinary acts observed with subtle attention. By nightfall he returned to his study, considering the human habits revealed by these minor incidents. In Flaxborough, the extraordinary was often embedded in the ordinary, concealed by routine, and only revealed through the patient tracing of hints, glances, and small errors. The second incident, as minor as it might appear, had done its work. It complicated the tidy theory of Mr. Grafton, expanded the field of potential actors, and illuminated the careful orchestration behind Sister Agnes's absence. Purbright, undisturbed and contemplative, allowed the pieces to settle, aware that patience and subtle testing would soon bring the hidden pattern into view. That evening Purbright sat quietly at his desk, the gentle lamplight falling over the neat stack of notes, scuff marks, and small observations he had accumulated over the past days. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, considering the nature of human behaviour in a town as polite, orderly, and subtly competitive as Flaxborough. It was often in the unremarkable gestures, the whispered conversation, the glanced at flower display, the slightly shifted ribbon that intentions revealed themselves. He thought of Sister Agnes, meticulous and reliable, whose absence had thrown the town into minor disarray. There was no overt malice in her disappearance, he reflected, yet something deliberate had clearly occurred. People moved through Flaxborough with a consciousness of reputation, habit, and subtle rivalry, and these forces, combined with personal curiosity or anxiety, could create actions easily misread by the casual observer. Purbright's mind returned to the various threads: the nervous steward, the resentful Mrs. Pennington, the attentive junior sister, the misplaced glove, the absent bicycle, and the carefully tucked notes. Each detail, taken alone, suggested nothing beyond the ordinary. Taken together, they hinted at a pattern of quiet deliberation. It was human nature, he noted, to conceal the ordinary under the guise of normality, yet the ordinary itself often contained the extraordinary, if examined closely. He allowed himself a small smile at the thought of Flaxborough itself, so meticulously polite, so concerned with appearances, yet each street and shop and lane full of minor intrigues waiting to be noticed. The town's rhythm, while outwardly serene, was punctuated by subtle disturbances, small slights, discreet rivalries, and private concerns. His task, he realised, was not to unearth sensational acts, but to trace these gentle ripples back to their origin. By candlelight he reviewed his observations once more, noting the juxtaposition of routine and anomaly. Where did the glove belong? Why had the bicycle been moved? What significance lay in the small bundle of notes? Each question teased at motives, preferences, and minor tensions, yet offered no immediate answer. Patience, he reminded himself, was the instrument of understanding. Hasty judgments would unravel the delicate web that human behaviour had woven. He also considered the subtle hierarchy within the convent and town. Respectability carefully maintained, minor grievances quietly nursed, private thoughts expressed in half-spoken sentences. These factors, he mused, often held the key to comprehension, far more than conjecture or the eagerness of well-meaning neighbours. One could observe, prompt gently and test reactions. The truth often responded to civility and attentiveness rather than force. As the night deepened, Purbright felt the faint outline of understanding take shape, not yet a full image, but enough to guide his next moves. He would continue to watch, to listen, and to inquire politely. The town would speak in its customary whispers and glances, and when the time was right, the subtle orchestration behind Sister Agnes's disappearance would emerge as clearly as the morning sun over the Flaxborough rooftops. The following morning, Purbright made his rounds with a quiet purpose, though to the townspeople his movements seemed leisurely and habitual. He lingered at the flower hall, noting the angle of sunlight on the prize ribbons, the faint indentations in the dust, and the subtle shifts in the chairs that suggested recent use. Each observation was deliberate yet unobtrusive, a gentle probe into the town's daily rhythm. Later, he called upon Mrs. Pennington, whose roses he had long observed from the edges of social gatherings. "I was wondering," he said in a tone of courteous curiosity, "if you might recall whether Sister Agnes mentioned any errands yesterday morning, particularly involving the flower hall or the convent garden." Mrs. Pennington's hands tightened around her teacup. "Errands?" She spoke. "Yes, but only in passing." "Nothing of note, really," she replied, eyes flicking toward the window as if measuring the distance to the next observer. Purbright allowed a pause, deliberately drawing attention to the bundle of notes he had recently discovered at the convent gate. "These were found tucked under the garden gate," he said softly. "The handwriting is unmistakably Sister Agnes's. Perhaps you might recognise the style of thought." Her lips pressed together. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, and her voice took a careful, measured tone. I have seen her notes before. Quite meticulous, yes. But what you have there, it seems unusual." Purbright nodded slowly, making no further comment. The subtle unease in her manner was enough. It revealed more than a direct question ever could. He knew that careful observation, coupled with gentle suggestion, often prompted the guilty to betray themselves through their own habitual gestures or half-formed excuses. He continued with a short visit to Sister Beatrice, framing his inquiries as curiosity about the convent's daily life rather than suspicion. Sister Agnes appeared to have certain routines, he remarked casually, yet these notes suggest she might have deviated. Did you happen to notice anyone she met or perhaps exchanged glances with in the garden lane? Beatrice hesitated, then admitted, "There was someone briefly." "I did not see much, only a shadow of movement near the roses. I assumed it was a visitor or perhaps a gardener." Purbright thanked her and left, reflecting quietly on the pattern forming. It was small, understated, but coherent. The glove, the bicycle, the mislaid notes, the subtle disturbances, and now the reactions of those around him. All hinted at careful orchestration by someone accustomed to moving unnoticed, yet capable of revealing themselves in small telling gestures when prompted gently. By afternoon he returned to the flower hall with a single purpose, to test the pattern. He arranged the dahlia display with slight intentional misalignment, leaving the white glove visible but apparently misplaced. Then he observed from a distance, noting reactions with the patience of a chess player, anticipating a calculated move. Within an hour, Mrs. Pennington appeared at the hall, ostensibly to inspect her roses, but clearly drawn to the subtle disorder. Her gaze lingered on the glove. Her steps faltered slightly, and she straightened the ribbons with a nervous precision that betrayed more than mere concern for aesthetics. Purbright, observing in silence, allowed the moment to pass. the soft tension confirming his suspicions. He smiled faintly to himself. In Flaxborough, the guilty rarely confessed outright. They revealed themselves through gestures, timing, and the careful adherence or deviation from social norms. With this test, the delicate truth had begun to surface, quietly and politely, without dramatics or confrontation. Purbright requested the company of the Mother Superior and a few of the key townspeople, including Mrs. Pennington and Mr. Grafton, in the drawing room of the convent, a space carefully arranged for comfort and civility. The fire burned gently in the grate, the light catching on polished wood and neatly stacked hymnals, lending the gathering an air of ordinary domesticity rather than formal inquiry. He began in his usual understated manner. "I have spent some days observing the minor disturbances surrounding Sister Agnes's absence. The glove at the dahlia display, the bicycle missing from its usual place, the bundle of notes tucked beneath the garden gate. All small incidents, yet each speaks of deliberate action." His voice was calm, measured, the cadence of routine rather than accusation. "The first suspect, Mr. Grafton," he continued, "was nervous during initial inquiries, yet the evidence does not implicate him. His gestures were consistent with a conscientious steward, uneasy at the scrutiny of others rather than any wrongdoing." He allowed a polite pause, letting relief settle briefly over the steward's expression. Purbright then addressed the room with soft emphasis. "The truth is rarely dramatic in Flaxborough. Often it is the ordinary, acted with intention and subtlety, that creates the appearance of mystery." He motioned slightly toward the white glove and the misaligned ribbons. "These, alongside the absent bicycle and the small notes, all point to someone accustomed to moving unnoticed, someone who blends ordinary routine with minor, deliberate deviations." Mrs. Pennington shifted in her chair, her hands tightening slightly. Purbright's voice did not rise. It merely suggested reflection. "It was you, Mrs. Pennington. Your admiration for the flower show and the convent's routines, coupled with your minor grievances, led you to create a slight disturbance. You moved the bicycle briefly, left the glove near the dahlia display and hid the notes, all to prompt attention, and, perhaps, to orchestrate a private lesson in observation for those around you." A pause followed, gentle and civil, as the words settled. Mrs. Pennington's lips pressed together, then released in a faint sigh of acquiescence. Her cheeks were lightly flushed, a combination of embarrassment and quiet relief. "You wish to remind others," Purbright said, "that even minor actions, carefully considered, are visible to attentive eyes. You intended no harm, merely to intrigue and disturb the ordinary complacency of the town, to demonstrate subtle influence. All the signs, the glove, the bicycle, the notes, and the slight disorder were orchestrated by you, guided by curiosity and your own sense of decorum." No one in the room gasped, no one shouted. Flaxborough did not do drama. Instead, there was polite acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of human eccentricity rendered in civility. Mr. Grafton smiled faintly at the relief of exoneration. The Mother Superior inclined her head in quiet approval of the calm resolution, and even Mrs. Pennington allowed herself a small rueful smile. Purbright concluded with his customary understatement. "The town can resume its routines, and in observing closely, we learn not only of events, but of character, intention, and the subtle shifts that compose daily life." He paused, letting the gentle warmth of understanding settle over the gathering, the mystery resolved not with drama, but with quiet civility and precise reasoning. In the days following the revelation, Flaxborough resumed its unhurried rhythm, the streets once again filled with the ordinary murmur of polite conversation and the occasional clink of teacups. The flower show had concluded, the ribbons returned to neat storage, and the convent's routines resumed without fanfare. Yet, for those attuned to subtleties, a faint ripple lingered in the air. Mrs. Pennington, relieved yet quietly chastened, returned to her garden, tending her roses with the same meticulous care, but now with a faint smile that suggested private amusement at her own minor theatrics. Mr. Grafton went about his duties with renewed confidence, unconcerned by the earlier suspicion, yet mindful of how easily appearances could mislead. The Mother Superior ensured the convent's daily rhythms proceeded undisturbed, her calm composure a quiet anchor for the sisters. Purbright, meanwhile, settled back at his desk in the modest police office, the familiar comfort of paperwork awaiting him. he reviewed reports and notes, arranging the small details with quiet satisfaction. Each entry, each minor observation, reaffirmed the subtle truth he had uncovered. In Flaxborough, ordinary life held extraordinary nuance, and the smallest gestures could carry meaning far beyond their apparent insignificance. He paused briefly to gaze out the window at the quiet lane where the convent stood, its stone walls serene in the afternoon light. The bicycle rested once more in its usual place, the glove neatly laundered and returned, and the notes safely filed. All was as it should be, yet Purbright reflected on the town's habits and secrets with a patient amusement. Human nature, he mused, was both predictable and endlessly intricate, a tapestry of intention, habit, and occasional mischief. The streets, the shops, and the convent corridors carried on as if nothing had occurred, yet in small glances, whispered acknowledgments, and fleeting gestures, the memory of the mystery endured. Flaxborough, ever polite and orderly, had experienced a gentle disruption, one that taught observation, patience, and subtlety, without descending into chaos. Purbright returned to his ledger, dipping his pen with calm efficiency, satisfied that the pattern had been traced, the lesson gently imparted, and the town's equilibrium quietly restored. Life in Flaxborough moved onward, ordinary yet enriched by the small truths revealed, and the inspector allowed himself the comfort of routine, knowing that, in time, the town would continue its cycles of minor intrigues, always observed with patient attention, always understood in their understated entirety.